Good morning, everybody. Uneducated Economist here. In this video, we are going to talk about the Federal Reserve's recalibration of monetary policy. This is something that you're going to hear quite a bit about over the next couple of months as the statement on long-run goals and monetary policy strategies is coming up for review. Now, this statement was adopted back in January of 2012 as a communication tool for the Federal Reserve to give forward guidance to the markets in order for them to then not have a shock and awe event, but then could actually use their words to guide the markets in a direction in which that the Federal Reserve felt was most appropriate. So this statement on long-run goals and monetary policy strategies is coming up for review in January of 2024, and I think this has a lot to do with the recalibration talk that you're beginning to hear out there. I'm not going to read from the whole statement. I'm just going to read this little section here. It goes like this. The committee has the ability to specify a long-run goal for inflation. The committee reaffirms its judgment that inflation at the rate of 2% as measured by the annual change in the price index for personal consumption expenditures is most consistent over the long run with the Federal Reserve's statutory mandate. The committee judges that long-term inflation expectations that are well anchored at 2% foster price stability and moderate long-term interest rates and enhance the committee's ability to promote maximum employment in the face of significant economic disturbances. Here's the critical part. In order to anchor long-term inflation expectations at this level, the committee seeks to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time, and therefore judges that following periods when inflation has been running persistently below 2%, appropriate monetary policy will likely aim to achieve inflation that is moderately above 2% for some time. Now, that is not very clear on what that means. 2% inflation rate over time, moderately above that. What does that exactly mean? Now, this statement on long-run goals and monetary policy strategies was reviewed and actually detailed out in a Jerome Powell speech given August 27th of 2020, right after that statement was given. Now, the speech is titled "The New Economic Challenges in the Fed's Monetary Policy Review." And this is what he had to say inside of this speech, because it is quite incredible to consider that the Federal Reserve was actually looking for inflation at the time. This is what it has to say. The persistent undershoot of inflation from our 2% long-run objective is a cause for concern. Right? The persistent undershoot of inflation from our 2% long-run objective is a cause for concern. This is what they were concerned about back in 2020. Many find it counterintuitive that the Fed would want to push up inflation. They wanted it up. The Fed want to push up inflation. After all, low and stable inflation is essential for a well-functioning economy. And we are certainly mindful that higher prices for essential items such as food, gasoline, and shelter add to the burdens faced by many families, especially those struggling with lost jobs and incomes. However, even though all this pain and stuff, inflation that is persistently too low can pose serious risks to the economy. Inflation that runs below its desired level can lead to an unwelcome fall in long-term inflation expectations, which in turn pull actual inflation even lower, resulting in an adverse cycle of ever lower inflation and inflation expectations. So you hear the concern that was going on and how much that they were like, we have and persistently under 2%, and we are going to need to figure out a way to push up inflation and make it run persistently above 2%. All right. This is what it has to say. We have made important changes with regard to the price stability side of our mandate. Our long-run goal continues to be inflation rate of 2%. Our statement the statement, right? The one that I just read to you. The statement emphasizes that our actions to achieve both sides of our dual mandate will be most effective if the long-term inflation expectations remain well anchored at 2%. However, if inflation runs below 2% following economic downturns but never moves above 2% even when the economy is strong, then over time inflation will average less than 2%. Households and businesses will come to expect this result, meaning that inflation expectations would tend to move below our inflation goal and pull realized inflation down. You hear the concern. Very concerned back in 2020 about making sure that inflation is the persistently too low of inflation is a problem that they must face and deal with. To prevent this outcome, this is again back to the speech, to prevent this outcome and adverse dynamics that could ensue, our new statement indicates, right? Again, this is the statement indicates that we will seek to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time. Therefore, following periods when inflation has been below 2%, appropriate monetary policy will likely aim to achieve inflation moderately above 2% for some time. Very much like what the statement said, right? Following periods when inflation has been running persistently below 2%, appropriate monetary policy will likely aim to achieve inflation that is moderately above 2% for some time. And again, that was the statement on long-run goals and monetary policy strategies, which was reiterated again by Jerome Powell's review of that particular statement. He goes on to say this: in seeking to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time, we are thus not tying ourselves to a particular mathematical formula that defines the average. What? You have no mathematical formula for figuring out this 2% over time average? Thus, go back to the speech. Thus, our approach could be viewed as a flexible form of average inflation targeting. Our decisions about appropriate monetary policy will continue to reflect a broad array of considerations and will not be dictated by any formula. So now I know a lot of people are going to lose their mind over that and say, okay, so the Federal Reserve is just going to make things up. They're going to go and say, all kinds of crazy conspiracy theories about it. But the Federal Reserve does have a way of viewing inflation. Now, this is coming from the Richmond Fed. Let me make sure I got that right. Yep, the Richmond Fed. It's called Macro Minutes, October 17th, 2023. So it wasn't but a year ago. Long-run average inflation. This is what they had to say because they don't have a mathematical formula for figuring this thing out. But this is what the Richmond Fed had to say about it. Notably, in the update, the FOMC did not define the window of time over which it would be looking back to assess the progress towards its goal. By looking back far enough, it is possible to identify a starting date where average inflation through the present day has come in exactly at target. Now, this is important because a lot of people who are thinking that the Federal Reserve doesn't have, like after hearing the statement from Jerome Powell saying they don't have a mathematical formula for figuring it out, they do have something that they are looking at, and this is it. Nobody's talking about this, so remember this. And I'm going to leave links down in the description for all this stuff, okay? All right. It says, by looking back far enough, it is possible to identify a starting date where average inflation through the present day has come in exactly at target. For example, now we have to take in consideration this was October of 2023, so again, this is almost a year old. But, let's just kind of take it for what it is. In the figure, it shows that when you consider inflation from October of 2008, so you got to go 2008, you go all the way back to 2008, right at the start of the Great Financial Crisis, through August of 2023, right, when this particular paper came out, headline PCE inflation averaged 2% per year on average, right on target. So this is the way the Federal Reserve is looking at it. They're considering all the inflation that we have, and they look backwards. Like, we're going that way, but they're looking back at inflation and saying, okay, how much inflation have we experienced? How much deviation from the 2% target? All this average inflation that we put together, how far back will we have to go to find where we actually hit a 2%? It was in August of 2023. They had to go all the way back, looking all the way back to October of 2008, and they were able to find a 2% average inflation. That is the only form of mathematical ability to judge what it is that the Federal Reserve is looking at for their 2% target over time. Is that they look back and say, how far back do we have to look to find a 2% target, considering all the inflation we have experienced today? So now let's move on, because this gets even deeper, guys. Michelle Bowman, who is very influential at the Federal Reserve, all right, who was the only member of the FOMC to vote for a quarter percentage point cut as opposed to a whole half a point, on April 5th of 2024 had a speech. And remember, this is just a few months ago, really, right? April of 2024, and we're towards the end of September. So this is what she had to, and this speech was risks and uncertainty in monetary policy, current and past considerations. And in this, she had to say, another notable change to the strategy statement was the adoption of what some refer to as asymmetric flexible average inflation targeting, or temporary price level targeting. Specifically, the new statement noted that in order to anchor long-term inflation expectation at its 2% goal, the committee seeks to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time, and therefore judges that following periods when inflation has been running persistently, below 2%, appropriate monetary policy will likely aim to achieve inflation moderately above 2% for some time. She just reiterated the statement. The long-run goals of she just reiterated the statement of long-run goals and monetary policy strategies. The revision to and this is back to her speech, the revision to the FOMC statement focused on monetary policy in a world of structurally low interest rates, disinflationary forces, and an apparent insensitivity of inflation to low levels of unemployment. This is important to understand, because the Federal Reserve used to look at employment as a main issue for their monetary policy, and they found that they could run employment as hot as they want, and it doesn't create the inflationary scenario that they were looking for. Think about the end of the Obama administration and pretty much all the way through the Trump administration. We had incredibly low unemployment, historically low unemployment, and failed to achieve the inflationary scenario that they were looking for. This is exactly what she is talking about. The apparent insensitivity of inflation to the low levels of unemployment. Although the revised statement reaffirmed the committee to the Although the revised statement reaffirmed the commitment to the committee's inflation target, it did not describe how the committee would respond if inflation were to run persistently above its 2% goal. Right? It doesn't say that, but here's the thing. They don't need to state it. They don't need to have a plan for an inflation that ran away. Why? Because inflation moderately above 2% is what they are looking for, and that is exactly what they are getting. See, now you go and you listen to Waller, who has just came out, one of the Fed officials who has just came out saying that, the reason why he had the half a point cut. And he talks about inflation that is now, the CPI is now running under the 2% target, but yet it's the year-long average of CPI. It's the CPI on an annual basis that is running moderately above 2%, and that is what Michelle Bowman was committing to, right? Was to make sure that long-run goal of inflation is at 2% anchored, but that the appropriate monetary policy would have current inflation running moderately above 2%. You see, like it's not dissent within the Fed itself, right? It's just that one of them is more committed to that particular statement, is what I'm getting out of it. All right, so moving on to something called the makeup strategies. For those of you who don't believe, like, maybe that COVID screwed it all up and that the Federal Reserve is flying off the seat of their pants, you have to take this into consideration, the makeup strategy. Now, again, like I've tried to communicate out there, that it's more about their words than it is their actions. And the makeup strategy is what validates that. Now, listen to this. And this is, I'll leave links down to all this stuff. This is, I believe, on page 3 of the makeup strategies. And it says, the makeup strategies work best when the public understands, believes, and reacts to the policymakers' commitment to offset misses in inflation from the 2% objective in the future. All right. Again, I'll read it again. Makeup strategies work best when the public understands, believes, and reacts to policymakers' commitment to offset misses in inflation from the 2% objective in the future. In particular, makeup strategies are most powerful when policymakers can influence the public's inflation expectation. Again, right? In particular, makeup strategies are most powerful when policymakers can influence the public's inflation expectations. In doing so, policymakers face a dynamic tension. They must maintain long-run inflation expectations around 2% objective, while at the same time moving shorter-run inflation expectations in response to the new strategy, which is moderately above 2%. Given the centrality of these expectations, our paper begins by surveying some empirical evidence. Measures of long-run inflation expectations appear to be well anchored. However, recent evidence from surveys also suggests that long-run inflation expectations respond to persistent changes in realized inflation and could therefore become unanchored if current inflation environment persists. You hear that? If you have a current inflation, it will actually ruin their monetary policy. It will cause the inflation expectation of the future to become unanchored. So they have to have this variable inflation expectation of the current moment in order to anchor it in the future. Isn't this crazy to think about? Again, let me read it. Measures of long-run inflation expectations appear to be well anchored. However, recent evidence from surveys also suggests that long-run inflation expectations respond to persistent changes in realized inflation and could therefore become unanchored if current low inflation environment persists. They have to have it bouncing around. On a short run, inflation expectations, a body of research has documented that these expectations seem to react to new information more slowly and to a lesser extent than assumed in most theoretical models. Informed by these empirical findings, we examine how makeup strategies with an emphasis on the average inflation targeting, right, as in the companion paper, perform in variance of the Federal Reserve Bank's U.S. macroeconomics model under various assumptions about the expectations formations. In general, we find that makeup strategies can moderately offset the real effects of adverse economic shocks. Right? The makeup strategies can make up for the real effects of adverse economic shocks. This feature holds true even when much of the public is uninformed about the monetary strategy, so long as the financial market participants understand and believe the policymakers' commitment to the strategy. However, to the extent that the public is uninformed about it or does not believe in or act on the commitment to the makeup strategy, policymakers will have to respond to initial periods of low inflation with aggressive policy accommodations in order to implement the strategy. potentially leading subsequently to the substantial overheating of the economy and a sustained period of inflation above 2% objective. I wonder what their next monetary policy strategy could be. Let's have a discussion about that down in the comments section. You guys let me know. Oh, and by the way, for those of you who are wondering where I've been for the last few months, I do live streams daily. So those who have been coming to my channel and saying, man, you haven't posted a video in months, I do daily live streams. Just click on over to the live side and you will find all the videos you could ever possibly imagine. Uneducated Economist, you guys let me know. Links are down in the description.